Welcome to The Convenient Truth, our second series on decarbonization, as we try to untangle the truth and consequences of climate change. The series features 3 interviews of Yogi Schulz of Corvell Consulting by Ron Murch of the Haskayne School of Business at the University of Calgary. Both have a lifetime of experience in riding Alberta's roller coaster, the plight of the oil and gas energy industry. In this, the first episode, Yogi explores the problem. Let's listen. Ron, over to you.
With me today is Yogi Schulz. We are both longtime friends and colleagues, and we may have some differing, but not necessarily conflicting views and perspectives on the topic we're going to talk about today, which is decarbonization. My background is in computer applications for business and executive education. I spent most of the last 40 years with the Haskayne School of Business at the University of Calgary. I'm originally from Ontario, but I've lived in Alberta since 1970, and I've also worked with the City of Calgary, Deloitte Consulting, and as an independent consultant. You can move to slide 3, Yogi. Today we're planning 3 parts to this session, as Perry alluded to. What is it that we see as the climate change challenge that's facing our societies? And that's kind of global, societal, and also industry oriented. I think Perry's probably going to comment, I think, that this challenge is really worthy of some clarity because there's quite a bit of confusion around, particularly the bit about the anthropogenic aspects of that. The second part basically is, why should we even bother worrying about it? And if there are solutions, the third part, there's kind of tension, I guess, between reason and emotion on why we should bother even worrying about it. And then the third part is, if we actually want to worry about it, what can we actually do? And there's a certain amount of passion and a certain amount of politics involved in about that. And over the past 3 years or so, Yogi has been collecting data and been following various discussions and speculations on the accusations, particularly as those impact our Alberta energy-based economy. Some truths are indeed inconvenient, and actually some may not be truths at all. We'll be using a number of slides in this session, and for those of you that are attending, if you wish to get a copy of these, Yogi's reference information is on the last slide at the end of the presentation. And I think, Yogi, you're quite comfortable if people reach out to you directly and ask for the slides. Is that correct?
You bet, Ron. Whatever people are interested in, be happy to contribute.
Oh, excellent. Okay. Well, Yogi, perhaps you'd like to take it from here and introduce yourself and the situation as you see it. And as we go through this first session, I'll just chime in with a few questions to maybe kind of direct our conversation.
Okay, thank you, Ron. So who am I? I founded Corvell Consulting about 20 years ago. We're in the information technology business. We do a lot of management consulting. A lot has to do with the oil and gas industry. I write a regular column at IT World Canada, and I've presented to many audiences about many topics, including this one. Most of them have been focused on information technology. So just to expand on what you heard from Ron about what are we going to talk about today, we're going to talk first about the problem, and we're going to illustrate that with the fact that the CO2 levels in the atmosphere are increasing, and the greenhouse gases trap heat in the atmosphere. That's really why they're called greenhouse gases. And our global temperatures are rising, and we have some adverse impacts from all of that. So what can we expect in the future? What are the trends of these things? Because our energy consumption is increasing, so likely our greenhouse gas emissions will increase. And that leaves us with needing to address very ambitious decarbonization goals. Now, and then In the future, we'll have some solutions that we'll discuss those next, and the tactical actions that we can take. And perhaps this is an intergenerational issue. What are our children expecting? So what's getting in the way? Well, there's some difficult consequences of the solutions, and the citizen support for decarbonization is frankly a lot more ambiguous and cautious than you sometimes hear in the media. And there are lots of impediments, and there are dysfunctional consequences of pushing on decarbonization too hard. And there's lots of misinformation out there, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And we'll talk briefly about the climate change deniers, what they're all about. And we'll end with a few conclusions and recommendations. So with that start, let's talk about the first topic, which is what's the problem? A lot of confusion about what the problem is warrants clarification, and I hope to do some of that right here and now. Stated succinctly, the problem is too much CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So in this section, we'll discuss what is triggering the need for decarbonization. The one-line summary is that the increasing levels of CO2 in the atmosphere are changing climates. That's why we need to decarbonize. Now, to back that up with some facts, here is the CO2 level in the atmosphere expressed in parts per million. And you can see from the line that it's increasing. So some people will say, well, wait a minute, even though the increase is 50% from the start of the Industrial Revolution to now, the total doesn't seem to be all that material at 417 parts per million. Why are we getting excited about this? Well, it turns out that this increase is enough to unbalance the atmosphere and trigger climate change. Another way to look at this is to look at the annual emission from fossil fuels for all countries since 1750. And you can see that it's quite dramatic. China surpassed the United States in annual emissions recently. And if you look at it just from 1850, when this all started, it's a good indicator, this chart, I think, of the enormity of the overall problem that we're trying to address in the way of decarbonization. Well, maybe this chart is another way to look at it. For the year 2020, this chart shows greenhouse gas emissions for major contributing countries. Now you'll notice that Canada and many countries are well below 2% each.
Yogi, you've got on this slide, you mentioned CO2, but there are other greenhouse gases which are carbon-based. Is there a reason you're focusing on CO2?
Yes, so greenhouse gases and CO2 are not synonyms. We tend to focus on CO2 because the CO2 is 75% of the problem. Other gases that are also greenhouse gases contribute the other 25%. Now, as it happens, the CO2 is in fact the least damaging of all the greenhouse gases, but because it has the highest volume, that's why it exists at 76%. Methane and nitrous oxide on a per molecule basis are a lot more damaging. So the methane is a byproduct of producing fossil fuels. So that should have a lot of focus in oil producing countries. And in fact, 3 countries generate most of the methane: United States, Russia, and Iran. And we could make huge improvements by focusing on reducing the methane because, oops, sorry. Because the methane comes from a very small number of countries and a very small number of sources, unlike the CO2 that comes from virtually everybody on the planet, plus all the businesses, plus all the governments. So there's a lot of advantage if we were to focus on the methane portion. The nitrous oxide arises from agriculture, fuel combustion, wastewater management, industrial processes. The fluorinated gases come from refrigerators, air conditioners, foams, and aerosol cans. So that's why we talk about CO2 the mostest. So some people ask, well, which sectors of the economy generate most of the greenhouse gases? Well, it's energy. And by that, I mean mostly the consumption of energy, like our furnace, our cars, all of that. The production of energy is actually just 6% of the global total. And oil companies keep throwing up their hands in frustration because they keep being vilified as the problem, when in fact, they're only a small contributor to the overall problem. So it's our energy consumption in buildings, transportation, industry, agriculture. That's what the big thing is. So some people say, well, is the temperature really going up? And this is a chart that shows the global land and ocean temperatures for January in all of these years, just that 1 month. There's 12 of these charts, but it really doesn't matter which one you look at. The temperature increase has reached 2 degrees Fahrenheit, as you can see at the top right. Now, again, you may say, well, 2 degrees, that doesn't sound like much. A place like Calgary, that might actually be a good thing. However, it's deadly for some plants and animals. For other plants and animals, it expands their habitable area. So the distribution of problems is uneven. And in fact, there are some advantages for some species in some territories with an increase in a temperature. And that's what creates a lot of the confusion in the discussions of decarbonization. So let's just look at some quick examples of the impact. There's not a lot of snow in Athens, but recently there has been some. We're all familiar with the wildfires in California. Many of us will probably remember Hurricane Harvey in Houston, Texas. More recently, the floods in the lower mainland in BC. We've had the record-sized tropical cyclones in the Philippines last year. We had droughts enough to bring out locusts in large numbers. Last week or 2 weeks ago, we had these massive snowstorms in the USA Northeast, enough snow to meet the highest levels ever recorded.
So, Yogi, you've obviously got some eye-catching imagery here. And even if there are interesting correlations that we haven't seen those kinds of events before, how does that translate into some kind of causal relationship, or does it?
Well, there's certainly those who challenge the causal relationship. There's a bunch of scientists that have done a lot of work, and a trivial Google search will bring up that, to me, unequivocal scientific background to the causal relationship between the CO2 and these temperature increases.
Well, are the alternative viewpoints reasonably defensible?
I don't think so, but they're superficially appealing, which makes them so difficult to refute. So for example, people will say, well, CO2 is plant food. And they're right, it is. And then they point to some satellite images that show that some parts of the planet are greening more than they have in the past. And lo and behold, that's true as well. So it makes it more challenging to defend or explain the causal relationship between increases in CO2 and global warming. And the answer is that the 150 150 increase in parts per million is enough to unbalance the climate. And that's why we're seeing the temperature increase. And some people struggle with believing that. But to me, this is a very interesting event held in the Maldives particularly to demonstrate the impact of climate change. You're probably familiar with this country. It's a series of islands that go from north to south off the south coast of India. And they staged this underwater cabinet meeting to highlight the threat of global warming because they're the lowest lying nation on the planet. The facts are that the increase in sea levels caused by ice melting in the Arctic and Antarctic are leading to coastal cities to flood more often. That we have the extinction of many amphibians, particularly frogs, due to a fungus that's spreading more efficiently at a higher temperature. You remember the virus Zika that infested California some years ago? That's a global warming. The emergence of other viruses like HIV, Marburg, and Ebola, and perhaps even COVID-19 are attributable in some ways to global warming. So what's the future hold? In this section, we'll discuss the outlook for decarbonization. How will energy consumption and GHG emissions increase in the future? So here's the global energy consumption forecast. It shows a 50% increase by 2050. Now, we keep coming back to 2050 because all the goals for decarbonization are anchored in 2050. That's why it shows up again and again on these charts. Now, what you'll notice is that all the greenhouse gas emitting energy sources show an increase in production during this time period, not a decrease as we claim we want to achieve decarbonization. So what's causing this hefty increase in energy consumption? Well, only some people in the first world are making any effort to reduce their energy consumption and environmental footprint. Billions of people have emerged from abject poverty comparatively recently in India and China. Another billion are likely to emerge from poverty in Africa. These billions of people are experiencing a better life, moving from poverty to lower middle income. The population of the earth is increasing. So everybody is increasing their per capita energy consumption. Meeting this increase in energy demand while reducing greenhouse gases will require more nuclear than this forecast on the right here suggests. It'll require more use of carbon capture, utilization, and storage, which isn't even on the chart. That will materially increase the cost of energy and will increase the use of hydroelectric, which is so small today that it isn't even on the chart. So expect major changes in that area. Now, our future greenhouse gas emission scenarios are worth a look. The do-nothing scenario is the broad line at the top. So the current policies being pursued by various nations is the second wide line here on this chart, this area here. And this is expressed here in gigatons of emissions. The third line is the current pledges and targets. This is what, if you add up what everybody said in Glasgow, this is what you get, an increase of 2.4. Well, we know that the target is somewhere between 2 and 1.5. So we have a long way to go. And this line, pledges and targets, by the way, assumes everybody who has proudly beat their chest in Glasgow will in fact do what they said that day. So whatever they don't do means the line will go up and the gap to those pathways goes down. So we have some ambitious decarbonization goals. This chart shows the historic emissions and forecasts for large emitting Asian countries. This chart picks on these 5 countries because they pretty well determine whether or not we're going to get close or not close to the targets we claim we're pursuing. When you look at the fact that China is forecasting a remarkably small increase in emissions during the 10-year period between 2020 and 2030, much lower than they've ever achieved in the past, and then they're going to have a dramatic fall off while their economy is growing. So that seems unlikely. India is forecasting a significant growth in emissions that is likely accurate given its huge dependence on coal, its limited efforts to control emissions, and its continuing economic growth. Russia is forecasting a tiny increase. Again, that's likely accurate because its huge oil and gas production is unlikely to go much more, and its lackluster overall economic growth. India is forecasting a significant growth in greenhouse gases because of its growth, and Japan is forecasting a decline that's likely accurate, given its limited use of coal, significant reliance on LNG, and shrinking population. Now, if you look at those dashed lines beyond 2030, China is forecasting a remarkably rapid reduction that I don't think is credible, but that's what they claim they're going to do. India isn't forecasting at all. I suspect they're going to have more growth. Russia is not forecasting. I suspect there's not going to be a lot of growth there. India is not forecasting. I expect significant growth. And Japan is forecasting a plausible decline, which I think is likely accurate because the population is shrinking and the decline that needs to happen is only so small.
Such an optimistic note, Yogi.
I'm going to weigh in here, Yogi and Ron. I really want to emphasize this last slide and what you have contributed leading up to it, and that is energy consumption is essentially a human issue, which warrants change in lifestyle. We talk a lot about government, we talk a lot about industry, government as a regulator and industry as a producer, but the reality is, how do you get human beings to change their lifestyles without changing your form of government or your form of regulatory forces? Japan, as you noted, may have the gift, and that is their population is declining. I think it was Bill Gates, who makes the point that maybe we've got to deal with population growth. Well, maybe, although maybe nature will take care of that on its own. The second point of emphasis was your comment, and it wasn't offhanded. I think it's intentional. Is nuclear. As we've all noted as part of these webinars for some years now, keep your eye on nuclear, because the stories about nuclear seem to be rising more and more frequently, that advances are being made. The byproducts of fusion, I'm not referring to fission, but fusion energy, are non-existent relative to fission. So we may have a good news story emerging about the sources of energy that don't require a lot of infrastructure, which hydrogen does. So there's some good news stories possibly on the horizon that may be arriving, or technology is arriving just in time. Any further comments you want to make, Yogi or Ron?
Well, I'd like to go back to a comment that Peter put into the chat session. Yogi, I don't know if you saw it, but he raised the observation that it's particularly relevant in Canada and probably in Russia as well, that there's major releases of methane coming from decay of frozen muskeg. And that is going to have a significant effect, both in terms of methane contribution, but also as the thawing occurs, creating sinkholes, which may bring some other unanticipated consequences along with them. Now, I don't know, Peter, if you want to elaborate on that, or Yogi, maybe have you come across that observation before? Do you want to make a comment on that?
Well, go ahead, Peter, if you want to add anything, and then I'll comment on it.
I don't need to add anything. I think that was a great summary of my point. I think this is a big issue. It's a natural process, and it's over a vast territory of the planet in terms of, you think of the size of places like Siberia. So although the warming will be beneficial from a human occupation point of view, it's going to have a lot of additional problems as unintended consequences, as was just pointed out, for example, with what might come out of those sinkholes could be the next pandemic. Okay, so Peter, you're right. This is an issue that has received very little attention. Incentive should be for us to try to reduce the
temperature increase by as much as we possibly can. So it's a great incentive to move down this chart and not let it spin out of control. Because the more we let it spin out of the coal, it's actually an effect that's on top of what's currently going on. So if you want to add the methane from Siberia, it's going to go up way up here, right off the top of the slide.
The point, however, is if we're going to reduce emissions, you're going to have to get human beings on this earth to change their lifestyle. I don't see that there's any other answer unless you just cut off the production of energy.
So the lifestyle is an interesting question, Perry. How is it that Europeans can have a lifestyle that's roughly comparable to North Americans and do it at roughly half the per capita energy consumption of North Americans? And the answer is, it's because it's more densely populated. They live in apartments. They drive fewer miles per day or per year or per lifetime, however you phrase it. So it suggests that it is possible to significantly reduce energy per capita energy consumption and not have to make big sacrifices in life.
Do you have data on Hong Kong, for example, as a comparator?
So I don't have it at my fingerprints. Okay. I'm sorry, but I agree with your idea there.
Yeah. Well, in any case, I think the point taken, and it came up in the earlier decarbonization series as well, is that changing human behavior is not easy.
Well, I think too, Perry, we'll probably come to that as we get into part 3 of this, but it looks like we have Peter and Vahid both have their hands up for a comment as well. Peter, do you want to amplify further on your point?
Yes, I do. Thank you very much, Ron. I just wanted to add, of course, that the Arctic region, more than the southern region of the world, as in the Antarctic, is actually warming significantly faster than the planet as a whole. So this too is an issue with respect to my point about methane coming out of melting permafrost. And there's a fair amount of research, of course, being done in this area. Not that, I mean, permafrost has been studied as an academic pursuit in geography departments, for example, around the world for a long time, at least certainly in countries that have some cold. And there's a lot known about it, but we have no way of controlling over a vast landmass the capturing of this methane. It's just going to continuously leak out as the temperature warms. And so this is a big problem that has not been addressed in the sort of same way that CO2 as being talked about here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Peter.
I think this brings this episode to a close. Welcome to I guess we're going to call it the Inconvenient Truth now, our second series on decarbonization, as we try to untangle the truth and consequences of climate change. The series features 3 interviews of Yogi Schulz, interviewed by Ron Murch of the Haskayne School of Business at the University of Calgary. In this, the second episode, Yogi explores solutions. Over to you, Ron and Yogi, your turn.
Well, having explored the aspect of what the challenge is and getting actually a little bit of interesting discussion going, it would be worthwhile to look at what some of the strategies might be. What's the science of decarbonization and how does it contribute to this kind of dealing with the challenges that face us? And so in this section, that's what Yogi will explore. For a problem of this magnitude, of course, with worldwide implications, the solution actually consists of multiple initiatives and significant technology interventions. It's probably not appropriate to talk about the solution or a solution. It's probably more appropriate to talk about a series of strategies and so on. And so Yogi, let me turn things over to you. We introduced ourselves at the beginning of the first portion of this. I don't think we need to do that again, but perhaps you'd like to introduce us to the science behind decarbonization and a little bit to the strategies that we can pursue in order to address some of the challenges.
Okay, thank you, Ron. So what are some of the strategies? What is the science and the technology of decarbonization? In this section, we want to demonstrate that reason can, in fact, trump the widespread emotion that too often dominates the decarbonization conversation. The emotions include panic, that the problem is so big that it can't be solved, anxiety about the projected cost, determination to pin the problem on somebody else, outrage that the problem is being foisted on mankind by a hidden conspiracy. But we want to stay away from the emotions and talk about the strategies that achieve decarbonization. I believe it is possible, although we are unlikely to achieve it by the proposed current goal, which starts at about 2050 and in some cases extends to 2070, as we've seen on some of the previous chart. The strategies, as Ron mentioned, involve a wide range of actions that will involve every part of every economy and every society. Here's the list of strategies that we'll examine individually on the subsequent slides. Implementing these strategies on a large scale will require government policy development, basic science research to validate the government policy, regulatory development, regulatory approval of significant industrial scale projects, technology development, and last but not least, dollars for significant investment. So the first place where I think we can start, and this is often overlooked as we look at grandiose solutions, is to simply increase energy efficiency and conservation. Businesses, governments, NGOs, homeowners, all have many opportunities to increase energy efficiency and conservation and thereby decarbonize. So let's look at a few ideas. We can improve motors, reduce oversizing, implement higher efficiency motors. We can improve buildings with better lighting, windows, HVAC and insulation. We can reduce waste and scrap. We can shorten supply chains, which reduce transportation costs. We can replace truck trips with railway trips. Railways are more energy efficient than trucks. Notice how this whole focus on just in time actually takes us in the opposite direction, because trucks are more flexible, even though they're more expensive than railway. We can reuse industrial waste heat. There's lots of heating of materials that create significant waste all throughout industry. We can reduce transportation costs. Industry drives many components along the manufacturing chain on many trips that can consume a lot of gasoline and diesel. We can reduce water use. Many industrial processes use an awful lot of water. We can increase the population of densities. So businesses are reluctant, and so is everybody else, to invest in new equipment when the current equipment is not at the end of its life. We're all reluctant to change established processes and routines that seem to be working. So how should we encourage this change with a carbon tax? Some people prefer cap and trade. Others want more government regulation. But maybe this is the right thing. You know, we're all scared of the carbon tax, but the bigger problem really is climate change, not the carbon tax. So we can increase zero carbon renewable energy generation. Most of the energy generation is for electricity. We also make use of more of the waste heat that's a byproduct of electricity generation. So how can we decarbonize? We can change fuel sources for energy generation from coal to natural gas or LNG. We can increase industrial solar and wind, as you see here. However, to be effective, these technologies must be accompanied by industrial batteries and a smart grid that costs more money. We can increase solar, home, and wind. These technologies are not widespread because they're not competitive with energy from the grid. We can increase hydro and nuclear. The impediment with nuclear, of course, is a concern about radiation, With hydro, actually with both of them, they're very capital intensive to get started, even though they're cheap once you get into the operating phase. Perhaps we need to introduce more geothermal, like this example from Iceland, where the conditions are ideal. However, there are many other suitable locations throughout the world, and higher energy prices make geothermal economically viable. We can also reduce diesel for energy generation. Now, there's a lot of talk about electrifying energy consumption throughout the economy, and this is what's required here. We can change the fuel sources for consumption from this list of gasoline and other products on the left. This is a step toward decarbonization if the electricity generation doesn't produce any greenhouse gas emissions. Changing fuel sources for energy consumption from natural gas to electricity for heating, like has been started in Vancouver, in my view, is not just controversial, it's ridiculous because the electricity is inefficient for home heating. So it's almost impossible to craft a set of credible strategies, as was discussed in our last discussion period, for achieving decarbonization without nuclear involvement. This is because the decarbonization implies such a dramatic, massive increase in electricity generation and electricity consumption. The attractions of nuclear generation include zero greenhouse gas production, high energy density, which solar and wind don't have. They chew up a lot of land. They have the highest capacity factor. What that means is it's on most of the time. It's not down for maintenance. It's not missing the sun or the wind, and it has high availability. So we'll expect to see a lot more discussion of nuclear.
Yogi, I have let me interrupt you for a moment here. It seems that the sort of general orientation toward a transition to using electricity from other forms is really a physics challenge, maybe a chemistry challenge of transforming energy from one form to another, where we capture it in an easily captured form, or we have it in an easily available form, like solar or gasoline or something like that. And then we transform it into electricity. But at the same time, we want to encourage the use of electric power. Won't that mean distributing more electricity, substantially more electricity, through either existing grid or improving that? And all the while, the global population is increasing, so demand will be increasing at the same time. Is it even feasible to generate all the electricity that is required? This seems like what is generally referred to as a wicked problem or a wicked challenge, as opposed to a simple challenge. It's not easy. And it's probably going to be a huge political challenge, is it not?
I think you're right to ask those questions, because the demand for electricity will just go up like crazy. And you know, and we'll need a lot more grids to move that electricity around. You'll see in Europe now, they're building a lot of undersea cables and more connections in the grid without adding any generation capacity, just to make that electricity more available and sharing it. We'll have to do the same thing in other parts of the planet. So I'm expecting there's going to be a lot more distributed generation. And what I mean by that is we're going to have smaller plants that are more local. They may not have the ultimate inefficiency, but they reduce the grid problem. So for example, if you look on 9th Avenue at 5th Street East, there is a small generation plant that ENMAX used to own. And I thought it was really neat. It was the latest and greatest in cogeneration, which means it made maximum use of the natural gas it consumed, and it piped its waste heat underneath 9th Avenue to heat the city buildings and Bow Valley College. So that to me is an excellent example of what I think has to be replicated thousands of times across the planet to address what you're talking about. one of the problems we have is we actually have high fossil fuel consumption subsidies. That makes fossil fuels actually seem cheaper than they are to the consumer, making it even more difficult for those consumers to switch to something else, because it encourages overuse, leading to avoidable greenhouse gas emissions. These subsidies are significant in some third world countries, like you see here. And they're also were big in Egypt and Indonesia. Both countries wisely used the recent plunge in energy prices to get rid of the subsidies or dramatically reduce them with very little consumer impact. Mm-hmm. We even have this subsidy in Alberta. We call it purple gas. Some people don't like that because they benefit from it, but I think it's an example of something we need to get rid of when we want to be serious about decarbonization. Okay, we also can introduce zero carbon fuels like hydrogen. The problem with hydrogen is what you mentioned earlier, Ron, is that we have to create it with energy to tear apart some molecules to generate the hydrogen. So we like it because it's a renewable energy source, but it's really only renewable if we generate it using renewable sources. I know that sounds a little bit circular. It has an almost unlimited supply. It's the most common molecule in the universe. It can be produced, meaning distributed locally. It doesn't have to be in big plants the way we generate electricity using natural gas or nuclear. There are no emissions. However, we still have problems with the cost of producing it, storing it, transportation. And as you know, it's highly flammable. It's very explosive. And so far, its production is still dependent on fossil fuels. So the extent of the benefit remains to be seen. To me, there's an opportunity here, but there are some people, I think, who are overhyping this.
Overhyping it what way? The negatives or the positives?
The positives, sorry. They're seeing it as a silver bullet for decarbonization.
Well, there's a major announcement forthcoming that I'm aware of in Alberta that will add another few $100 million into Alberta's investment in hydrogen. So clearly Alberta seems to feel that the disadvantages can be addressed.
I'm not discounting this, and I'm not trying to dismiss it. I'm just trying to avoid overhyping it.
You're not alone, and I'm not overhyping it either, but I'm saying I think the point that you've made around hydrogen is worth diving into, just as the discussions around nuclear need further investigation. So
absolutely. So I see all of these energy sources or energy generation or electricity generation alternatives. They're all part of the solution. There is no silver bullet here, and we probably whatever we can think of is part of the solution. I mean, even algae is part of the solution in certain circumstances.
Part of the aspect that you, Yogi, and Perry are skirting around right now is how should the various governments or political elements pursue investment in a variety of strategies so that the most promising strategies can in fact be teased out of the various approaches that we have in order to pursue them in a more deliberate fashion. Like, we can't just look at single solutions. We need a spectrum. Otherwise, as a wicked problem, we're not going to learn enough as we go through solving it or addressing it.
We're going to address, I think we're going to address impediments in the third session, because I'm just itching to get into the role of government and financing and markets and socialism. So let's hold back on that for a moment. And I'm looking to myself. So,
okay.
Go ahead, Yogi.
All right. Moving on. We're going to be introducing carbon capture, utilization, and storage. There's no way around that. The problem with it is that it's at this point quite costly. But on the other hand, some early investments have been made. So for example, the good people of Saskatchewan have invested $1 billion, whether they realize it or not, and built the first ever carbon capture from coal-fired electricity generation. And that CO2 is being used by Cenovus in the oil field to maintain formation pressure to improve production. So that's great. But if it wasn't for that $1 billion, it would never have happened. Similarly, in Alberta, the provincial government in Stelmach's time invested over $1 billion to spur this on. And we still have a ways to go to make this cost effective, but we'll probably have no choice but to pursue it, because all of the sources of CO2, it's unlikely that we're going to be able to prevent them all. Some will end up having to be stored underground forever.
Yogi, do you have any insights with CO2 capture or carbon capture and storage? Do you have any insights yet, or have any emerged as to the longer term implications? Are there any unanticipated consequences of underground storage?
Well, the unanticipated consequence that everybody points to is, oh, it's going to leak. And there is a remote risk of that. That risk goes up significantly if you do something incompetent. In this case, the incompetent thing is when you abandon these wells, you do that incompetently. But so long as you abandon these wells competently, the CO2 is going nowhere, because it's deep enough underground that that's impossible. We'll also need to scale various technologies to help us with this. We kind of touched on the enhanced oil recovery in Weyburn that Cenovus is using the CO2 from the Boundary coal-fired electricity plant. It turns out we can also make interesting chemicals from CO2, such as methanol, urea, and polymers, if with the right chemical facilities. There are CO2 fuels that are typically made from a mixture of hydrogen and carbon monoxide that's derived from CO2 and mixed with hydrogen. That has possibilities. Microalgae, what they do is they fix CO2 at high efficiencies to produce biomass, which again are fuels and high value chemicals and use a lot of CO2. There's been a lot of experimentation in this area, and we're still learning how to scale this up. Concrete building materials, it turns out that CO2 is very effective at curing cement to reach the strength that it needs. So expect some consumption of CO2 there. This is important is because there's a lot of CO2 generated in the production of cement, and everybody is looking for solutions to reduce that. And if it can be incorporated into concrete, that would be a very immediate solution. We also have the idea of facilities that remove CO2 from the atmosphere. This is a drawing of the one that's an upscale of the one that's proposed for BC by a company that's working on that. And this is the plant that actually exists today in Iceland that sucks CO2 out of the atmosphere and injects it underground. It's not yet profitable, but it got built because of the carbon credits system that in Europe, where you have to pay to pollute with carbon, and this facility is financed by that. Ron, you want to jump in here?
Well, as you move through these, I don't know, 7 or 8 different overall strategies that you've talked about, you haven't really mentioned any what I would call softer strategies like education or government funding of basic science or those kinds of things. Are you going to get to those a little bit later?
Education was more under the way to reduce one of the impediments. Government subsidies, I mentioned them briefly, and Perry also talked about those, and I think they're most valuable when government funding is used to advance the technology rather than pay out subsidies for people to behave in certain ways, because that gets totally out of hand.
You know, Yogi, you, like I and many of us, have been referring to technologies as the solution. And so be it. I mean, we've lived now for 100 years where technology always seems to arrive at just the right moment. It's conceivable that this is not going to get solved technologically and that the social implications will be profound.
Yeah, so you're right. Mankind has been bailed out by technology on many, many, many occasions for literally millennia. And this time around on this problem, technology will be an important component. And I've tried to refer to some of the components, but technology by itself is not going to solve this one. So there's another interesting aspect here is what is the next generation. You know, this generation wants action on climate change and decarbonization. They've received a lot of environmentally conscious material at school. They've heard about major environmental destructions like cutting down the Amazon rainforest, overfishing, disposal of plastics in the oceans, reduction in biodiversity, overuse of fertilizer that's changing the oceans, overuse of pesticides, killing some species and polluting groundwater. They've also been fed nonsense, such as oil and gas producers are polluting the atmosphere. Nuclear energy is so risky and dangerous that we should stay away. Fracking pollutes groundwater. Pipelines contribute to GHG emissions. We're not doing enough for the poor. Our society has too much inequality. So the next generation might not understand the costs and implications, but they've heard a lot about environmental damage in school and on social media. If we can add more energy literacy, this is that education component you talked about, Ron, to the fervor and the enthusiasm of the next generation, that will build a commitment to decarbonization. Improved energy literacy will also mute the impact of wacky proposals that receive astonishing support. So what are some tactical actions that are to close in on net zero? You know, some of the items I've talked to, you know, they require new technology. They require building vast facilities. They require billions of dollars of capital. Well, you know, I don't know if we will reach net zero, if even possible to reach net zero. What I do know is that we can use our energy resources more wisely. And as we do that, we are decarbonizing and reducing other adverse impacts. So this is a list of actions that we can start on immediately. They don't require new technology, huge capital budget, long wrangles for regulatory approval, years of potentially risky construction. You know, these are things that can start today. For example, about 1 billion people can reduce their energy consumption. Well, we talked about that earlier already. Most industrial processes can reduce their energy consumption from whatever they're doing today. The most important ones are steel making and cement production, because they produce so much GHG today. Natural gas producers can reduce their GHG, especially methane. And I mentioned Russia, Iran, and the USA because they're the three biggest pollutants on this. Alberta can beat its chest on this because it has some of the lowest methane emissions per unit of oil and gas production on the planet and is regularly rolled out by the World Bank as an example to follow. Manufacturers can materially reduce the volumes of plastics that they consume, use less in packaging, make the packaging they do use more recyclable. Building owners can reduce their energy consumption at a very small cost in capital, and sometimes this even yields operating cost reductions. Farmers can reduce fertilizer and water consumption. I'm always astonished at how much those irrigation sprinklers run in southern Alberta, and the fact that agriculture uses half the water we consume in Alberta. I think they're very wasteful, and somebody should call them on that. It turns out that you can reduce the methane emissions from cattle by about half through selective breeding, so we should be doing that. Homeowners in the Northeast USA can replace oil heating with natural gas for their homes. That's a very little net cost and a significant benefit in reduced GHG emissions. So there's an immediate opportunity right here and now.
Thank you, Yogi. Thank you, Ron. This will conclude episode number 2. Welcome to The Inconvenient Truth, our second series on decarbonization, as we try to untangle the truth and consequences of climate change. The series features 3 interviews of Yogi Schulz of Corville Consulting, by Ron Murch of the Haskayne School of Business at the University of Calgary. In this, the third and final episode, Yogi explores the impediments to change. Welcome, Ron and Yogi. Your turn.
Okay, we've had the opportunity to discuss the challenges and some strategies to address those challenges, and now we need to explore what we can actually do about those concerns or challenges, I guess. We have to recognize that there are likely going to be some individuals that feel that this is far too complex an issue for them to have an impact as individuals. We have companies who've been told for about 100 years that the reason for existence is to make profits for their shareholders, and some capitalistic jurisdictions actually have legislation that requires them to do that. But that's at odds with investing in very long-term energy efficiencies. Possibly investing in energy efficiencies in any event. So that's a bit of an interesting issue. We've got politicians whose planning horizons mimic the election cycles. And right now in the US, that's every 2 years. And we have scientists whose modeling seems to ignore some of the softer dynamics and issues in society. And I'm curious to find out what you think we actually can do about this.
Well, fortunately, there are some solutions to these impediments, Ron. So yes, the decarbonization is possible, although I don't think we'll achieve it within the time horizons of 2050 to 2070 that's currently being held out there. So we'll discuss some of these impediments that you alluded to, Ron. And among the impediments that we're facing is the passion with which some are expressing the idea we need to move much faster. That's actually an impediment. Politics, where politicians know exactly what needs to be done, but they also know that the citizens can't or won't choke down what needs to be done. And citizens who are blaming politicians for the disruption of their lives and their finances that will be triggered by decarbonization. So let's take a look at this in a little more detail. What are the challenges to this analysis that we heard in the previous presentation? There's a broad scientific consensus that climate change is caused by a material increase in CO2 in the atmosphere. Even with this consensus, there are quite a few people that challenge the relationship. And most of the challenges are focused on small details, or some people are deliberately trying to mislead others. So for example, some people ask, how can any molecule present in only hundreds of parts per million have a significant impact? It's not so much the absolute value, but the unbalancing of the carbon cycle and this small amount of increase is enough to do that. Some scientists ask, how can we rely on climate models with various problems? There are errors and uncertainties in every model that's ever been built. However, that fact doesn't preclude there's value in the model. Some politicians believe that they can increase the likelihood of their re-election. There's that election cycle Ron talked about, by repeating and amplifying the uninformed, misleading, and dismissive views of climate change deniers. That's a sad fact in today's political environment that has misled so many. Some people are prone to believe conspiracy theories. One conspiracy theory believes that climate change is a hoax perpetrated by an elite clique that wants to use this trumped up crisis to extend its control over humanity. Another theory believes that climate change is a pretext for implementing a significant redistribution of wealth. Some people believe that the indicators of climate change have been grossly exaggerated to build support for an extremist environmental agenda. They point to higher and lower concentrations in the atmospheres that have existed during various previous geologic time periods. It's true that some trends such as glacial receding, biodiversity reduction, and animal habitat loss have been exaggerated to advance an over-the-top environmental agenda. However, the underlying trends are still real. Some people point out that CO2 is plant food and the more is good because it's greening the planet. In fact, some parts of the planet are greening. Some land that is not productive before is becoming arable in some parts of the planet. Northern Alberta is an example of that. However, these trends are overshadowed by the amount of land that's becoming less productive due to drought and flooding and temperature problems for whatever species of plant is being grown by the farmers. So there are difficult consequences of the solutions that we discussed in the last presentation. Here are some consequences that are scaring citizens, business leaders, and politicians. These consequences are a huge incentive for individuals and others to avoid decarbonization measures, stick their head in the sand, and hope the problem will magically disappear of its own accord. To come closer to the decarbonization goal will require dramatically higher energy costs for consumers. And consumers are going to whine about that because they perceive very little benefit from that. Businesses will whine about costs and worry that they can recoup, whether they can recoup their higher costs or they're going to lose market share to competitors that are not playing by the rules. Governments will like the photo ops for politicians, but will worry about added costs and taxes. There's going to be a significant carbon tax plus lots of regulation. These actions create lots more government involvement in the economy that will be challenged by many. Making the carbon tax more revenue neutral will help, but it's unlikely to occur because government keeps needing more money to pay for the services that its citizens are clamoring for. We're going to see increased prices for consumer goods. Consumers struggle to buy into uncomfortable actions today for benefits that are a generation or two into the future. It's interesting that this price issue is occurring as we speak, as the inflation triggered by vast government deficits are coming to be realized. So we're going to have new tariffs on imports. These are going to reflect the extent to which manufacturers of products that are importing failed to comply with decarbonization expectations. These tariffs will be challenging to establish without a lot of negotiation. We're going to have reluctant politicians because higher costs and inconvenience creates irritated consumers. And since consumers are also voters in much of the developed world, politicians will be reluctant to increase cost and inconvenience. And consumers and government will have to overcome their exaggerated fear of nuclear energy generation. So this is the third time this has come up in this series of presentation. The small modular reactors will need to be placed into service. Opposition to permanent storage of nuclear waste will have to be overcome. Ironically, the current temporary storage facilities that have now been in use for many decades are riskier than the constructed and proposed permanent storage facilities. Now, there's another interesting thing here is how much of your budget would you be willing to give up to improve the environment? Well, citizen commitment to the environment appears to be widespread. However, it is not deep. The minute personal costs increase and a minor inconvenience is required, much of the citizen commitment evaporates. On one hand, there are more people who are interested in the environment. On the other hand, there are more people who perceive their households are under financial pressure due to rising costs and rising taxes and rising inflation. So I think there are two trends there that are very much conflicting with each other. So we have some impediments such as politicians grandstanding, painting a grandiose vision for a decarbonized future with no strategy to achieve that goal, increasing in taxes and debt, claiming to advance decarbonization, but not showing much reduction. We're seeing that in Germany, for example, and in Ontario, creating regulations that impose more cost than value. So even after the politicians, we have a general resistance to change. No one likes to change their current comfortable circumstance. There are huge capital costs and operating costs, producing higher energy costs and likely higher taxes when nobody wants to pay more. Low energy literacy is costing many not to understand that fossil fuel producers are a small part of the problem. So it's amazing how many consumers don't see the relationship between producing crude oil and the gasoline that comes out of the pump at Costco for them. It's mind-boggling. There are those who are lobbying to diversify the economy and want to make significant structural changes as part of the decarbonization effort. This is creating backlash from other parts of society. Another example is claiming that green jobs, whatever those might include, can replace all the oil and gas industry jobs being eliminated. We have extreme environmentalists pushing for even more change, like restructuring our cities, outlawing cars, adding more bicycle lanes, increasing low-income housing. And we have dysfunctional solutions, such as shut down coal-fired generation right now, quit building single-family houses, encourage local and home production. And what they often mean by that is clothing and food, restrict the size of houses. So we also have some dysfunctional consequences of pushing on decarbonization too hard. Now, Western Europe currently illustrates this consequence, where the natural gas prices are going through the roof. So we have looming electricity shortages in some places. In Germany, due to the crazy decision to retire the safest nuclear power electricity generation stations in the world, well before their end of life, high consumer prices for energy to pay for subsidies for renewable generation, natural gas shortages due to underinvestment in development, and we have the natural gas distributor bankruptcies due to government-imposed consumer price caps. So we have both trying to appease everybody with lower price caps, but not figuring out how you're going to pay for those. And we actually have overuse of coal-fired electricity generation, despite the plans for abandonment, because the solar and wind generation is insufficient and the distribution infrastructure doesn't have enough. And we have significant public debt created by subsidies to accelerate renewable electricity generation and the adoption of electric vehicles. So all of this is creating fewer unhappy consumers and high debt. Then we have misinformation that's undermining support for decarbonization. You know, people reject science. They're willing to assign credibility to dubious sources that know how to produce a nice looking YouTube video, exploiting the ambiguity in the forecast. They point out, the forecast changed. Yes, it changed because the model is improved, not because the model is wrong. Claiming man-made CO2 is not material, we discussed that. Declaring that fossil fuel energy producers create the problem when they don't. The plant food, which I examined, and then you'll love this one, applying this diversity, inclusion, and equity lens that is rampant in universities and in far left circles to decarbonization. So,
okay, Yogi. So how do we know it's misinformation? I mean, aren't the issues clear? Isn't the science clear? How do we tell it's misinformation? Why isn't it just different information?
Yeah, that can be a very difficult question to answer to a person who resists change, has limited education, has no energy literacy. You know, that becomes very difficult. How do I know that crazy YouTube video isn't just another legitimate perspective on the problem?
Are we simulating this right now with COVID? We have this public-private tension in COVID. We're getting the same thing in climate change.
I think that parallel you're describing, Perry, is absolutely accurate. I'm tired of COVID. And some people are saying, well, the efficacy of the vaccine falls off over time, so why bother? Which is totally the wrong conclusion.
But the interesting thing there, Yogi, of the comparison is, in the instance of COVID, the virus does change, and nature seems to moderate. Nature isn't looking like she's going to change as it relates to the climate, because if it is man-made, nature says to man, you're going to have to change, either your institutions or your individual behavior.
Okay. So the other thing is, as you may have heard this, is that metals are critical to decarbonization. So there's a lot of shifting industrial activity that has to occur. If you want to do more geothermal, hydro, nuclear, bioenergy, electricity, solar, hydrogen, wind power, more solar, electric vehicles, these are all of the different minerals that you're going to have to produce in dramatically higher quantities than we're doing today. And by the way, there's a page 2 to this list. Okay, and you'll notice that the most circles are in the electric vehicle column, and the wind power column is right up there too. So this is one of the things that's going to make decarbonization more difficult. So now this is the backlash slide. That's kind of what Perry kind of alluded to in his discussion of the similarity to COVID. Yeah, there's a lot of crazies out there, and some of them have a lot of following. It's, you know, we're all watching this Rogan fiasco on Spotify right now. You know, what an idiot. But he received a $100 million check. Maybe I shouldn't call him an idiot. Maybe I should be envious. I'm just saddened he got that much money for misleading millions of people.
But, you know, you don't need to point to the extremes to indicate how much of society is sympathetic to the retention of freedoms that they have come to enjoy in democracy. This is not, I think pointing to the extremes, we miss the point. Democracy has been built on individual freedom of expression. If someone says, I want to have a lifestyle, and I remember one of the presidents of the United States saying, there will be no change in your lifestyle. That sells.
Absolutely.
Well,
and I like to think I'm a proponent of freedom, but I also point out that there are limits to my freedom. And whenever I do that, I get a lot of backlash.
But the discussion today is the limits to your freedom may be nature telling you enough is enough.
Yeah, and not a politician.
At the risk of cutting off your emotional enthusiasm, Perry, freedom comes with responsibility.
Yes,
and
it does.
People want freedom with no responsibility.
I don't think no. We will find out. Look, we're on a journey here. We were on a journey with COVID, and we saw that people got weary, but the Omicron may be the end. With climate change, this is not going to go away as COVID seems to be going away, implying something has to happen in human behavior, or the powers that be that control human behavior, because nature is unrelenting.
Thank you. And this slide here demonstrates how difficult that's going to be when this percentage of the populace is highly skeptical. So some conclusions. Decarbonization is absolutely achievable. The alternative energy generation technologies exist. The alternative manufacturing technologies exist. Net zero is achievable, but it requires many behavioral changes. And that's what you talked about, Perry, a minute ago. It requires the commitment of all countries. That's what makes it difficult to achieve. Pushing too hard adds avoidable costs because of the spending on subsidies, the creation of stranded assets, and the technology risk if you push something too fast. So an example of that is carbon capture and utilization and storage. And so the cost to decarbonize is huge. Even if countries like the EU quit pushing too hard, the cost to revise energy production, transportation, industry, cities is huge. The change and disruption is huge, which is why there's all this backlash that we're likely to encounter. Building, maintaining multi-nation commitment to action is difficult, and we observe that in the annual climate conferences. Pushing too hard creates geopolitical consequences, never mind financial consequences. There are those who are convinced that Western Europe's determination to transition gives Putin additional power to advance his geopolitical agenda. And attempting to defer action actually has short-term benefits. If we defer action, it spreads out public costs. If we defer action, business expenditures also are less problematic. So what are the recommendations? We have no choice but to pursue decarbonization, but do it based on facts, not rumors, wishful thinking, or misinformation. Proactively implement these solutions, expect to revise these solutions as the science improves, increase. So that is a corollary to the use of masks for COVID-19. The direction changed over time due to improvements in our understanding, but that was spun as excessive government control or incompetent government leadership. We need to increase education. We don't want to push too hard. We don't need to beat ourselves up. And whoops, and that's the end of the presentation. Ron?
Well, Yogi and Perry, Perry, I'll turn things back to you in a second. There have been a few comments come through from Peter and Randall and others, Melhead and others. I'm wondering, Perry, if you're planning a follow-up session in this whole series where those comments could become part of the dialogue.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, I've got 4 notes here. One of them is clearly on the technical side, there would be value in visiting nuclear and getting an education a little bit deeper, and maybe even hydrogen. I think Dale Naley, I spoke with him recently, he would be most interested in it. But on the other side, I think we need to maybe bring a sociologist, a psychologist, maybe even an archaeologist about civilizations that have died, and have a discussion on the social side of the ramifications of this. So yes, I think this discussion will continue either in the form of just a chat or by bringing in some expertise to help guide us.
Well, I think too, Yogi and I had as we were sort of putting our comments together for this, we wound up with a conversation about terminology and how some of the aspects of terminology can be very loaded. And this is not the time to pursue this right now, but we may want to find a way to explore how the use of terminology can condition people's behavior and perceptions, particularly as it refers to misinformation, I think.
Well, one of the presenters in the earlier decarbonization series made an excellent point about logic is not selling. This is becoming, at the public level anyway, a very emotional discussion. And appreciating that communications, how you communicate, what you communicate, where, who does the communicating is critical if you expect to have a change in public behavior or at the individual level. And it's not working at present. I mean, the statistics you brought to the table say it all. The public is not buying it as it comes to changing their personal behavior in terms of the energy that they consume and the lifestyle they expect.
Fair enough. Well, thanks, Yogi. And Perry, I'll turn things over to you, and you can decide where to go from here. We're a little bit over time, but hopefully it's been interesting for everybody.
I think the comments are echoing much of the sentiment that Yogi brought to our attention. And Ron, thank you for guiding us through this. This has just been superb, Yogi. You are clearly not just a good student of these issues, but an excellent communicator. Your slides were precise and they were crisp, easily to understand. And I didn't get a sense that you're a political advocate for one position or another. You're a good educator. So I thank you, and thank you, Ron, for joining us today.